Imagine a city where your crime can never be hidden, because it's carved into the mask you're forced to wear. Murderers walk with black masks streaked in crimson, thieves with jagged gold, liars with shattered mirrors reflecting their deceit. In Eldridge, justice isn't about prisons, it's about shame. But when one young man, Lucien, dares to challenge the cruel law, he discovers the masks are more than symbols. They are weapons against the human spirit. This is the haunting story of the city of shame masks. In the city of Eldridge, whispers began like a soft wind before a storm. Rumors of a new law spread from alleyways to taverns, growing louder with each telling. The mayor, a stern man with an unyielding gaze, had decreed something no one had ever imagined. From now on, every criminal would wear a mask revealing their crime. It wasn't punishment by imprisonment alone. This was spectacle, public humiliation made mandatory. Murders were forced to wear black masks streaked with crimson, the red seeming to pulse with every movement. Thieves had gold masks etched with jagged lines, glinting in the sun as if mocking them. Liars wore fractured, mirrored masks that splintered their reflections, making them see themselves broken at every glance. And that was only the beginning. There were masks for fraud, assault, corruption, each designed to make guilt visible, unavoidable, and permanent. At first, most dismissed it. A mask can't make someone accountable, people whispered in shadowed corners. Shopkeepers debated nervously as they locked doors, and mothers hushed their children at bedtime, afraid even the mention of masks would haunt their dreams. But the magistrates insisted it was for the public good. They claimed that fear and visibility would deter crime, and that shame was sometimes more powerful than jail. Lucien, a young man from the poorer districts, watched it all unfold with a growing sense of unease. He had grown up navigating the city's darkest corners, where crime was survival, not choice. He understood desperation, the hunger that made a man steal a loaf of bread or slip a coin into his pocket. And yet, something about the masks chilled him. They didn't just mark criminals, they stripped away identity, humanity, dignity. The first public display happened in the town square, and it was horrifying. A man convicted of embezzlement was brought forth, his mask polished to a terrifying gleam, reflecting the horrified faces of citizens gathered around. Lucien saw the man's eyes dart behind the metal, silent pleas for mercy trapped in his gaze. The crowd recoiled at the sight, some in disgust, others in fascination. The shame wasn't abstract, it was tangible, like smoke that filled the square and seeped into the skin. By nightfall, Eldridge was alive with stories of the masks. Mothers whispered warnings, thieves plotted escapes, and tavern debates became heated arguments over morality. Could humiliation truly serve justice, or had the city crossed a line into cruelty? As Lucien walked home through the quiet streets, he noticed a small mask-maker's shop glowing in the dim light. Hundreds of masks stared back at him from the window, some leering, some sobbing silently, as if aware of the lives they would mark. He shivered. These masks weren't just objects. They were mirrors of the soul, reflecting not only crime, but the humanity that crime had destroyed. And Lucien, deep down, knew this was only the beginning. The masks had arrived, and with them, a new form of fear that Eldridge had never known. By the following week, Eldridge had transformed. The city streets were no longer familiar. They had become stages for a terrifying new spectacle. Every criminal's mask told a story in vivid detail, each a living symbol of guilt, and the people could not look away. Some masks were grotesque, others disturbingly beautiful, but all carried the same weight: shame made visible. Lucien wandered through the marketplace, careful to stay in the shadows. He saw a young pickpocket dart past, a gold mask gleaming. Under the sunlight, edges jagged like the panic etched across his face. Children froze in place as he ran by, and parents yanked them close, whispering urgent warnings. The fear was infectious. It spread faster than the masks themselves. Even the elders could not escape its effect. An elderly man muttered prayers as a black and crimson masked murderer passed, eyes downcast but aware of the crowd's gaze. People recoiled instinctively, unsure whether to offer sympathy or simply avert their eyes. The masks were not just punishment. They had become instruments of social control, reminding everyone that wrongdoing was public, unavoidable, and humiliating. Lucien noticed something disturbing. Masks affected more than just the criminals who wore them. Onlookers began to whisper accusations at one another, seeing guilt everywhere. A woman paused mid-step, staring at her neighbor as though the reflection of a fractured mirror mask had jumped into his eyes. Merchants glanced nervously at customers, unsure if they were being watched, judged, or recorded for some minor infraction. The city itself had grown paranoid, alive with suspicion. Curiosity drew Lucien to follow a thief through narrow alleys. The boy's mask glittered sharply, reflecting Lucien's own fearful fascination. Every step the boy took seemed amplified by the mask. He was smaller, weaker, yet more visible than ever. The mask magnified not only his crime but his panic, and Lucien realized with unease that shame could become its own kind of punishment, more powerful than prison walls. That night, the city felt different. From the comfort of his tiny apartment, Lucien stared out at the square. The masks gleaming under the lamplight seemed almost alive. Some whispered stories, others silently accused, but all carried a truth no one could escape. Crime had a face, and that face would be remembered. Lucien's thoughts twisted further. He imagined a city where the innocent could be accused, the guilty could escape, and the masks did not just reflect acts, but the collective fear of an entire population. He shivered, realizing that the law had created not only punishment but a spectacle, turning the eyes of every citizen into judges. And then he noticed something else. Some criminals were beginning to wear their masks with defiance, almost pride. Fear had begun to intertwine with curiosity and even power. Lucien understood the danger. The masks were no longer just instruments of shame. They were becoming symbols of identity, bending human behavior in ways no lawmaker had predicted. Eldridge had changed, and not for the better. Shadows of fear lingered in every street. Eyes darted nervously at reflections. And Lucien, more than anyone, felt the invisible grip of a city held hostage, not by criminals, but by the weight of its own fear. Life in Eldridge had shifted into something unrecognizable. The streets, once noisy and vibrant, now carried a tense hush. Every passerby measured each glance, each word, knowing that a mask could appear at any moment. The city had become a theater of fear, and the actors were both innocent and guilty alike. Lucien walked through the marketplace, noticing how even merchants had changed. They no longer greeted customers with warmth. Eyes darted constantly, scanning for the telltale glint of a mask. A man who had once laughed heartily now shuffled through his wares, his hands trembling as if the very air could accuse him. Parents kept their children close, warning them in whispers not to stare, not to attract attention. Even casual conversations were laced with suspicion. The first few days had been shocking, but now the real effect of the masks was becoming clear. They were more than tools of justice. They were instruments of social terror. Citizens began to avoid eye contact, whispering about crimes they had never witnessed. Murmurs of guilt spread faster than the law could enforce, and some accused neighbors out of fear rather than truth. A single rumor could turn a family inside out, a community suspicious of its own shadow. Lucien observed the spectacle in the town square once more. A murderer paraded past, black and crimson streaks catching the sunlight. His shoulders slumped under the weight of the crowd's judgment. Mothers shielded their children. Men turned away, and still, the eyes of strangers burned into him. Lucien realized that the true punishment wasn't imprisonment, fines, or forced labor. It was the invisible chains of judgment, of collective fear, that the masks had unleashed. That evening, Lucien sought out the mask maker, a small, dimly lit shop, tucked between a bakery and a tavern. The old artisan greeted him quietly, and without waiting for questions, he spoke. "These masks," he said, polishing a fractured mirror, "don't just cover faces. They mark the soul. They remind the world, and yourself, of who you are, or what they say you are." Lucien shivered at the truth in those words. The masks were no longer passive symbols. They were active forces shaping lives. Criminals could escape prison, but the mark of the mask could follow them forever. Families were torn apart. Friends grew suspicious of one another, and even those untouched by crime felt the shadow of shame creep over them. As he walked home that night, the city seemed heavier, as though the air itself carried judgment. Children peeked nervously from windows, dogs whimpered in the streets, and the marketplace was silent, save for distant murmurs of gossip. Lucien realized something terrifying. The law of the masks had created a city of spectators, where fear and shame had more power than justice, more force than law. And in the silence, he understood that this was only the beginning. The masks had taken root, and their reach would stretch further than anyone could imagine, touching every heart, every conscience, every shadowed corner of Eldridge. Eldridge had become a city of whispers. Every street corner, every marketplace, every dim alley carried a tension that was almost physical. People didn't just fear the masks, they feared what they represented: exposure, judgment, and the possibility that an innocent misstep could land a mask on their face. Lucien noticed it most clearly in the eyes of those who had been falsely accused. One evening, he stumbled upon Maris, a young woman hiding in a cramped apartment, her cracked mirror mask still strapped to her face. She hadn't stolen, lied, or committed any crime, but her father, in a bitter dispute over inheritance, had falsely accused her. The city's law had taken her and given her a mask, and now she trembled, haunted not by punishment, but by humiliation. Her reflection fractured across the mask, 1,000 tiny shards of shame. Lucien stayed hidden, watching the world through shadows. He saw how the masks had begun to warp behavior, not just of criminals, but of everyone. Neighbors accused neighbors over imagined offenses. Friends whispered about secrets, fearing that the next mask might belong to someone they knew. Even those untouched by crime carried a quiet paranoia, as though guilt could jump across streets and strike without warning. And yet, something darker was emerging. Some criminals had begun to wear their masks with a strange sense of pride or defiance. They learned to manipulate fear, to use the spectacle of their shame to gain attention, power, even sympathy. Masks intended to humiliate were becoming symbols of identity. Fear and fascination had blended, and the people of Eldridge were caught in the tension, unable to look away. One night, Lucien followed Maris to a quiet alley. She whispered, barely audible, "It's not just the crime. They want you broken. They want the world to watch while you suffer." Her words struck him with cold clarity. The masks weren't neutral. They were weapons, not only against the guilty, but against the humanity of the entire city. Lucien realized then that the law had done more than punish. It had reshaped society. Curiosity became obsession, fear became power, and innocence had no shield. The masks revealed crimes, yes, but they also magnified them, twisted them, and sometimes invented them entirely. The city, once vibrant with life, now existed in shades of black, gold, and fractured mirrors. Shadows moved differently, conversations carried tension, and even laughter sounded cautious. Eldridge had become a place where fear was as real as the sun overhead, where every glance could judge, and every reflection could accuse. And Lucien, more than anyone, felt the weight of it pressing on his chest. The masks had begun to control not just those who wore them, but the eyes of everyone who dared to watch. In Eldridge, no one was free, not even the innocent. Lucien could no longer remain a silent observer. The city of Eldridge had become a cage, invisible bars forged not of steel, but of fear and judgment. Every glance from a neighbor, every whisper behind closed doors, carried the weight of accusation. Innocence was fragile, and the masks had made it a target. Something had to change. He began seeking others who had suffered under the masks, those falsely accused, those crushed under the weight of shame, and those who had been forced to wear their crime as a public spectacle. They were scattered at first, fearful of being discovered. But gradually Lucien found a small group willing to act, united by a simple idea. Masks could take faces, but they could not take courage. The magistrates, confident in their law, paraded the masks openly. They believed that fear was absolute, that the spectacle would keep citizens in line. But behind closed doors, rebellion was quietly stirring. Lucien and his allies began sneaking into mask storage rooms, moving carefully in shadows to avoid detection. Some masks were destroyed, melted down in secret fires. Others were repurposed, worn as tools to mock the system rather than obey it. Every mask they reclaimed became a symbol. Shame could be resisted. The night of rebellion came quietly. There was no loud proclamation, no marching through the streets. It was subtle at first. A mask removed here, a face revealed there. Then it spread, like sparks catching fire. Citizens who had once trembled at the sight of a black and crimson murderer now stepped forward without flinching, peeling off the masks that defined them, refusing to be reduced to symbols of guilt. Lucien watched in awe as the city slowly transformed before his eyes. Gold masks, jagged and gleaming, were lifted from trembling youths, their hands shaking but their spirits ignited. Fractured mirror masks shattered in secret, leaving reflections whole for the first time in weeks. Even the magistrates were caught, off guard, witnessing the quiet defiance that had grown faster than their control. For the first time in months, Eldridge felt alive. Fear was still present, but it had lost its monopoly. People spoke freely, confessed mistakes voluntarily, and reclaimed the humanity that the masks had tried to steal. Lucien felt a surge of hope as he walked through the city square, shadows retreating as citizens shed the weight of public humiliation. The masks had revealed the fragility of trust and the cruelty of spectacle. But rebellion had reminded Eldridge of something more important: courage, resilience, and the unbreakable strength of identity. Lucien realized that true power did not lie in imposing shame. It lay in refusing to be defined by it. And as the first light of dawn touched the city, Eldridge stood on the cusp of transformation. The masks had been a warning, but the rebellion proved one undeniable truth. Fear could be wielded, but it could also be defied. Humanity, even under the heaviest weight of shame, could reclaim its face. In the weeks that followed, Eldridge began to breathe again. The masks, once a constant presence, had lost their power. They were no longer instruments of fear. They were reminders, silent witnesses of a city that had survived its darkest experiment. Citizens walked the streets with faces restored, and with them, dignity returned. Lucien wandered through the marketplace, observing the quiet rebirth. Children played openly, laughing without fear of judgment. Merchants greeted customers with warmth, and neighbors shared smiles instead of whispers. Even those who had once worn masks now moved without hesitation, their steps lighter, their eyes free. The city had rediscovered something it had almost forgotten: humanity. The magistrates, those who had once reveled in the spectacle of shame, were replaced. New leaders emphasized justice tempered with empathy. Punishments no longer relied on humiliation, but on accountability and rehabilitation. It was a painful lesson learned too late by some, but a necessary one. The masks, once a tool of absolute control, became artifacts, displayed only in museums, a stark reminder of the consequences of fear and judgment unchecked. Lucien found Maurice in the town square one morning. Her fractured mirror mask, long discarded, lay at her feet. She looked at him and smiled, a smile of relief and liberation. "It's over," she said quietly. "We're free, finally." Lucien nodded, feeling the weight of months of tension lift from his chest. The masks had tried to define them, but in the end it was courage, not fear, that reclaimed their faces. Even as Eldridge healed, the memory of the masks lingered. Shadows of the past reminded citizens that shame could be imposed, but identity could never be stolen entirely. People spoke more kindly, judged less hastily, and looked at one another with a deeper understanding. The city had learned that punishment could teach, but humiliation could destroy. Lucien stood in the center of the square, gazing at the empty streets where masks had once paraded. The sun glinted off the cobblestones, and he felt a quiet hope settle in his heart. Justice, he realized, was not about spectacle or fear. It was about restoring humanity, even after cruelty had left its mark. And so Eldridge moved forward, its people forever changed, yet stronger for the ordeal. The masks remained, but only as lessons in history, teaching that fear could be resisted, courage could triumph, and dignity could always be reclaimed. Lucien understood finally that while shame could touch a person, it could never define them. The city had survived, and in surviving, it had learned the true power of the human spirit. And so the city of Eldridge learned that no mask, no matter how cruel, could silence the will of the people. The council's rule crumbled, but the scars of shame they left behind would never be forgotten. Lucien's defiance became a spark, reminding everyone that true justice comes not from fear, but from courage. The masks were broken, yet their memory lingered as a warning. Power built on humiliation will always collapse, and hope will always rise.